Welcome to Talking Fraud, a podcast series by MIAA, providing you with informal insights on all things fraud. This podcast was recorded in April 2023, and all information within the podcast was correct at the time of recording. Episode 5, Conflicts of Interest. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Talking Fraud, MIA's anti-fraud service podcast. Today we're going to be talking around conflict of interest in the NHS and potentially how that overlaps with our work as an anti-fraud team and potentially the Bribery Act as well, but just in a general sense. But before we get into the detail of that, just some quick introductions from those around the table.
Hello everyone, I'm Darryl Davis from MIA and I'm Head of Anti-Fraud Services.
I'm Claire Smallman, Senior Anti-Fraud Manager, focusing on investigations.
I'm Kevin Howells, Anti-Fraud Manager, focusing on proactive work.
And I'm Paul Bell, your host today and also Senior Anti-Fraud Manager. So I'm going to hand over to Darryl in a second. We're just going to talk around conflicts of interest. It's an issue that sort of has always been on the agenda from our point of view in terms of making sure that declarations are known, third-party interests have been declared. Occasionally we might get investigation referrals about undeclared interests, but I know this is a topic that's close to Darryl's heart. So, Darryl, tell us what you know.
Conflicted.
I wouldn't go quite as far as that, Paul, but I think it's a very interesting subject for us to discuss on the Talking Fraud podcast. I suppose it's not specifically related to fraud as some of the other areas that we've covered in previous episodes, but I think it's something that's probably worth us having a little bit of a discussion around today. I suppose in terms of when we talk about conflicts of interest, we talk about situations where a person is in a position to derive personal benefit from actions or decisions made in their official capacity. And I suppose, some examples of conflicts of interest that we've talked about previously, for example, the PPE contracts and awarding of contracts by the government. We've all seen the various allegations that have been made that are subject to investigation at the moment around people or individuals approaching ministers in order to be fast-tracked for PPE contracts. And the argument being, should that have taken place on the basis that these referrals being made on the basis that they are friends or associates of the ministers involved? And I suppose there's two sides to that. One is, there's a governance and transparency issue there, but also I suppose at the time there was a need as well to get these contracts through and get things moving quickly. But I suppose it's understanding the nature of those relationships prior to the awarding of any contracts. And I think when you think about the NHS, the field that we all work in, there is a lot of tender activity going on around contracting for the new builds of hospitals, or even commissioning of contracts with private sector organisations to deliver a whole range of services, including kind of medical services. And there is, strict and stringent conflicts of interest guidance and regulations in place. I suppose what is interesting is that there's no specific legislation in place around conflicts of interest, as there are, the Fraud Act, etc. And do we think that really legislation is needed in relation to pursuing fraud investigations and concerns regarding conflicts of interest? Anybody got any thoughts on that?
I suppose we should probably begin by sort of saying NHS organisations, it's a declarations of interest policy that they have.
Yeah.
It's whether then a conflict arises because of the declared interest or potentially an undeclared interest that hasn't been volunteered. So it only becomes a conflict, obviously, if the declaration either isn't made and is hidden, or if it is declared, and then there is a conflict in terms of that individual's role in the NHS with the interest that they have declared. So that's probably just worth noting that in terms of clarification. Do I think there needs to be particular legislation? Well, I suppose in some respects, in the worst case scenario, the Bribery Act relates very closely to undeclared conflicts of interest. And if an individual hadn't declared an interest and it turns out later that they do have an interest and they haven't declared it and they've gained from that interest untowardly, then they potentially are subject to prosecution under the Bribery Act. I suppose the question is whether there needs to be some kind of governance legislation or requirement or regulation that requires people to make those declarations up front before there becomes a problem.
I mean, the UK is one of the outliers in terms of not having specific conflict of interest legislation. So, significant countries in Europe and also America do have specific legislation on conflicts of interest that sits alongside their existing kind of bribery legislation as well. So I suppose, as you said, we don't get a lot of kind of prosecutions either under bribery or related to conflicts of interest in the NHS, but it is an area, I suppose, of concern due to the nature of the kind of transactions that the NHS are involved with. And like you say, it's whether you declare or don't declare a conflict. But I suppose another part of that is what action does an organisation take once those declarations have been announced?
I suppose it from most NHS organisations, it sits under code of conduct and or disciplinary offences. So, and potentially the criminal offence if there's something untoward, it would sit under the Bribery Act. So those would be the policies, guidance, legislation that it currently sits under. So there is action that an organisation can take if someone breaches the requirements in those codes or policies or legislation. But whether there needs to be something more blatant in terms of the expectations.
I suppose it is more just the general point, isn't it? Is would there be benefit of specific legislation? And I think, like you say, probably the Bribery Act and elements of the Fraud Act, because I suppose you could argue failure to disclose information under undeclared conflicts of interest could potentially be another area where you may pursue a criminal investigation. So, I must admit, prior to doing the research, I didn't particularly ever feel there was a need for separate legislation around this. I would have thought policy, procedure within an organisation alongside the existing legislation would probably be enough to...
You've also got misconduct in public office as well. So potentially failing to declare and then benefiting from that relationship could be subject to the common law offence of misconduct in public office as well. So there is legislation. I think if we saw, or my own personal view would be, if we saw more cases relating to undeclared conflicts of interest, then yes, there might be a benefit in having some more preventative legislation in place. But I think at the moment we're not seeing an awful lot of that.
I think more needs to be done in organisations in terms of ensuring that the people who should be making those declarations of interest are doing so. And you see many times when we do our work within the fraud arena, where the percentage of people who should be making declarations aren't, and it's almost trying to work with the NHS organisation certainly to sort of increase on those declarations. Why aren't people making declarations? Still think even if it should be a nil declaration, so at least you've got some sort of response from an individual around whether it's truthful or not may be investigated at a later stage, but something to identify who's reporting and who isn't, and what are they actually reporting. And I don't think enough is really done on that.
It's historically difficult to get 100% compliance rate for declarations.
I know some organisations have linked it through to the appraisal process, and especially for those people who are going through the pay progression points on their pay scales, that if they haven't done the conflicts of interest, then they don't get the progression through the pay point, but that's few and far between. I wonder why it is that individuals don't complete these returns, because we see it as a common thread, don't we, across all organisations. I mean, some are only at 50% of the required level. And as you say, it's very, very rare that we get anywhere near 100%. So
I think some of it is potentially linked to what I do outside of the NHS is not necessarily your business. There's still a mindset whereby,
or even further than that, what my husband does outside the NHS is
or my son, or my close friend who I've known for 40 years or whatever it might be. So there is that. I think the further away you get from you yourself, I think it's a bit more of a tenuous link in terms of justifying that position. But I do think that some of it is part of a mindset. Some of it is, doing private work and then doing work for the NHS in and of itself isn't prohibited. It's where it conflicts and crosses over. And I think some people sort of self-manage that in terms of, I don't perceive there to be an issue. But as we always say with any of the work, preventative work we do around conflicts and declarations of interest, it's the newspaper test. Would you like to see your relationship with a third-party organisation and your role in the NHS openly discussed in a national newspaper or on a website? Would you be uncomfortable and embarrassed about that? If you say, yes, I would, then you should be declaring that relationship so that you're not the only one who's making the decision, that the decision is made and authorised, if appropriate, by other people in your organisation, saying, I fully declared this. This is a decision that's been made by others. I've not been party to that decision, and it's not been deemed to be a conflict.
So it's about protecting yourself,
It's protecting yourself, but also protecting your organisation as well. You know, we've talked elsewhere in other podcasts about people lying on CVs, and it's a breach of trust. If you're withholding information, then why are you withholding information? It's about being open and honest with your organisation. If you've got nothing to hide, then just declare it and then move on.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that conflicts of interest is one of those areas where the perception can be just as bad as the reality. I remember reading an article making a link between doctors going off on a training event to a ski resort in Europe at winter time, and this was at a point where there was a particular winter pressures within NHS, and there was lots of stories being reported about people queuing up in ambulances and on trolleys in corridors, and essentially making the argument that all these doctors were heading off to go skiing when they should be in the NHS working. And it was a front page headline. And when you actually read the article, you then realise they didn't have any real detail on how many people were actually going onto this training event, so how many NHS doctors it related to, or whether there was any link between these doctors not being there and issues at their respective organisations. But very often with the newspaper test, it's those headlines, isn't it, that grabs people's attention. So I think, like you were saying, Kevin, it's always better to kind of cover and protect yourself, isn't it? Because you're protecting not only yourself as an individual, but also the organisation that you work for as well.
And it's very closely linked as well. I mean, you mentioned there, declarations of interest in third-party organisations, institutions, whatever it may be, is very also closely linked to declaring gifts and hospitality from third parties as well. So you might not necessarily have an ongoing relationship. There might be a one-off relationship where you've received a gift or hospitality, and your organisation's policy should really cover that sort of issue, really. So the two things are quite closely aligned in terms of people declaring their interactions, really, and as we've always said, it's largely about the newspaper test. Would you be embarrassed reading about the gift that you received, the hospitality you've received, your third party interest in a national newspaper or on a news site? I think that's the issue.
When we talk about the low level relatively declarations of conflicts of interest, the levels of recording of gifts and hospitality across the board in NHS are traditionally very low, aren't they? And I wonder why that is at times, whether people don't appreciate what needs to be recorded, they're not aware of the process that needs to be followed, or whether there is something more untoward in relation to non-declaring.
I don't think it's always sinister. I think people within the NHS have been working hard, and particularly during the pandemic. And if a patient's given something to you, then you probably think you deserve it. And I, a lot of the time, don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
But there are rules that needs to be.
And it's proportionality as well.
Yeah, of course,
in terms of, how significant is the gift or benefit or whatever it might be? Is it within your, there are policies in place for this. This isn't alien to the NHS. There are very clear thresholds and structures in place. So if you want to sort of see, is this acceptable? First of all, check your policy. If it's not covered by your policy, ask the question.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the issue, isn't it? That people don't necessarily read the policies that are in place, and may just go to another member of staff, or can I have this? Oh yeah, of course you can. I've had that before. And actually, if you're the person taking receipt of whatever it may be, then it's your responsibility to understand your policy and seek some guidance if you're not too sure from managers. Not just accept that Joe Bloggs had done it or accepted something similar, so it's okay for you to accept it.
I think if you're a patient and or a family member and you're giving chocolates or flowers to people working on the ward for the treatment that you or a relative received, then that's fine, isn't it? If you're getting a bottle of whiskey or a hamper at Christmas from a supplier, then that's a slightly different situation, isn't it? And probably does need to be recorded and probably refused, I would say, as well.
But bringing it back, I suppose, Dale, to your topic about third-party interest, those are often more significant and more ongoing. I mean, even you could argue a hamper of food is maybe worth a few £100s, but often if it's about the awarding of a contract, a long-term relationship for goods and services, and there may be a perceived benefit to you from doing that, then that's on a different scale in some respects than sort of accepting a hotel room or a food hamper. So I think it is about transparency and it is about openness, and we've got to remember, we all work in the public sector. Even if you have private work alongside your NHS work, you're still bound by the old Nolan principles, which are probably, 31 years old now?
Yeah.
About openness, transparency, and all those kind of issues. Those have never gone away. So I think people need to be aware of that fact. And, what do we do about it? Well, as we sort of said, we don't get a lot of investigation referrals, but we do quite a bit of proactive work around conflicts and declarations of interest. And often that will involve us actually looking at what people have declared or not declared, as the case may be, and we'll do some background checks to see whether they've got an undeclared interest or whether they've got,
the director of a company, that sort of thing.
Yeah, or whether they've only partially declared some interests. And it's like, well, you've declared those, why have you not declared the others? And, we are all suspicious. So it's like, well, what was the reason why you declared some things but not other things? Now, 9 times out of 10, it's probably just simply ignorance, a lack of awareness, or your own perception that I didn't need to declare it.
Yeah.
But often we will issue reports, we'll do the background checks, we'll find things that are maybe incomplete, and we'll share those with the organisations. And then the organisation can make the inquiries about whether something should have been declared, whether there's a training need to make sure people know what they should be declaring, or whether there's something potentially more sinister.
Yeah, and I think the way the NHS has been developing over recent years, you're always going to have potentially conflicts of interest at senior level, because the way the boards are constructed now of organisations, you are looking quite rightly to bring in various individuals from different sectors, whether it's local government, whether it's from charities, third sector organisations, whether it's from primary care contractors like GPs, dentists, pharmacists, opticians. You want those people to be on the board and representing particular areas and areas of concern. But obviously, by their very nature, they're going to have conflicts in the decisions that they're making. And I suppose the important thing for organisations is A, you're aware of these conflicts, and B, that you manage them effectively. And I suppose linked to that as well is, what do we do when there is a breach? Who investigates those breaches? Should it something that be looked at internally? Should it be something that's referred to the anti-fraud specialist as a mechanism for looking into concerns? And what do we think on that? Do we think we should be more proactive in getting involved in some of those investigations and concerns?
Not initially. I don't. No. I think that the organisation needs to make a corporate decision about whether a potential undeclared interest is a concern for it, or whether it can be explained away through, the individuals come in from a different background, there isn't the same culture of openness because they come from a private sector organisation into a public sector body. Maybe they've not received training around declarations of interest, what the requirements are and things like that. So I don't think the default position should be to refer every matter to the anti-fraud specialist in the first place. I think the organisation needs to take a view on it, and then they refer it to us if they need to for an investigation.
And I think their background checks in terms of, if someone has failed to make a declaration and a company, either they're a director or they're involved in a company that we've then, as an NHS organisation, done business with, then that might be something that we need to look into. But again, whether that would be a sort of brief look from the organisation or whether it's passed to us, I think it's a case by case basis, isn't it, based on evidence and what we need to sort of look at in terms of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our remit is quite defined, isn't it? Ours isn't regarding criminality, and some of this could be governance process issue as opposed to criminality. So I don't think we should be involved unless there are significant concerns. And probably the first point of call is to look at it internally, isn't it? And for somebody somewhere to make an assessment as to whether they think potentially there's criminality involved, and if so, then that will be the appropriate point for us as a function to become involved in that. I think it's probably worth pointing out as well, when people think automatically of conflicts of interest, they tend to think of financial interests, but it may not necessarily be that. So it could be personal interest, benefit arising from a conflict. It could be a business that you're associated with, even though you're not financially involved with it. That could potentially be profit from.
Wasn't there a case on the South Coast where a chief exec was awarding contracts to her boyfriend's company, and also which hadn't been declared, so there was an issue there, not potentially fraud, but then the company was also providing false invoices for, it was graphic design, I think, for
work not done.
That's right,
for work not done.
Yeah.
So it does happen.
Absolutely.
And it isn't always sort of corporate stuff as well. I think that we've had situations whereby we've had 2 individuals who were partners being recruited into the NHS. One's an existing member of the NHS, the others maybe on a contract basis, and they're sort of not declaring that relationship or denying the relationship, and then providing references and so on and so forth. So, declaration of conflict of interest issues can be corporately, as you sort of say, from a contractual point of view, or they can just simply be personal and declared interests in terms of, appraisals for another family member or your partner or so on and so forth. So it can happen at sort of different levels, really. It can be personal declarations of interest as well as third-party interests in organisations and institutions.
Wasn't there, when I first joined MIA, you stepped away because you knew me previously?
Yeah.
Isn't that an example?
Yeah, I mean, it's a relatively low-level example, really, but it isn't just about getting people to make declarations. It's actually looking what the declarations are. That's a key element to all of this. But I think also as well, on another episode of Talking Forward podcast, we looked at the sort of reverse social engineering. And I think there's an argument to sort of say, if someone makes a declaration, but it turns out to only be a partial declaration, then you're not necessarily going to be top of the list of follow-up. It's going to be the people who haven't made a declaration. So you're deflecting further attention away because it's a nominal declaration. You've at least put something on your return. And from a cursory point of view, it's sufficient for you to sort of say, well, I've made a return, but it isn't necessarily complete and it isn't necessarily full. So there is that sort of psychological aspect that it might deflect attention away by doing that.
And I think it also goes back to the organisations as well, like you say, in a couple of cases, not just that one Darryl was referring to, where, we've had reports that individuals are not making a declaration of members of staff working for them. They may be authorising their overtime. Yet it's clear to everybody that those relationships exist. So, why are you not challenging the fact that there isn't a declaration been made as a manager? So again, it's just, we do get referrals, and sometimes we have to say, well, the information is within your possession and you've done nothing with it, yet you want us to then try and find a fraud.
I think that's a key point. I suppose to bring it back down to Darryl's opening comments about, does there need to be sort of legislation? Well, we expect due diligence, good background checks, good procurement procedures to be followed.
And I think the important thing is, though, from bringing it back to kind of the NHS perspective or public sector perspective, it's that there are, obviously policies and procedures in place within every organisation. And the best advice we could give to people is, if in doubt, declare it, and then it's up to somebody else to then make a decision of what to do in relation to that declaration. But if you don't declare it, then that's when you're potentially running into problems, isn't it? And the perception sometimes can be just as bad as I said, as the reality of the situation.
Okay, interesting topic for discussion. I'm sure it'll probably come back around again. I'm sure we'll continue dealing with declarations or non-declarations of interest in our daily work with our clients. So thanks to everybody for their contribution in this episode of Talking Fraud podcast, and we'll see you on the next one.
You can find MIAA's Talking Fraud through all the usual podcast platforms.